Welcome to Ground Control. I have two exceptional flying EDF jets, and I have referred to each of these EDF jets as being my favorite EDF jet so far. So the more time that I put on these EDF jets, the harder it is for me to determine which one of these is my absolute favorite. So I decided to sit down and write out a set of criteria on which to judge these EDF jets to hopefully put to rest what I think is my favorite EDF jet so far. I've got 4 EDF jets. 2 of them were passes. I don't recommend them. 2 of them turned out to be exceptional flying aircraft, and that's the Viper, the Aero's Viper, and the Eachine F16. Both of these are 50mm EDF jets, and just both of them are just rock solid. If you've never flown an EDF jet, you're wanting to test out an EDF jet, either one of these EDF jets, I highly recommend. They're exceptional flying aircraft. They're very aerobatic. They're extremely stable. I mean, they fly like they're on a rail. They're easy to launch. They're easy to land. They have exceptional glide profiles, which really surprised me for an EDF jet. And I highly recommend either one of these. But I have referred to both of them as my favorite. So, and I couldn't decide. The more time that I put on these 2 jets, the harder it is for me to decide which one is my favorite. So I did sit down and write out a set of criteria. I think you guys will agree with the criteria that I've set out to judge these 2 planes. And nothing, the criteria is going to be judged on a scale of 1 to 10. Nothing is going to get a 10 because nothing is perfect. But there's going to be a lot of 9s. There's going to be a lot of 9s in this scoring on this criteria. So in the upper left-hand corner, your upper left-hand corner, my right-hand corner, I will keep a tally on the scoring of each one of these criteria. I've got 10 different criteria in which to judge these 2 aircraft. So let's go ahead and start with the first one, and that's the build quality. Both of these are, the foam is molded, everything fit together exceptionally well. I didn't have any problems whatsoever on either one of these jets. So I think the build quality on both of these jets is really, really good. So I gave both, the F16 gets a 9 in that category, and the Viper gets a 9 in that category. On the ease of assembly, the Eachine F16 I gave a 7, and the Viper I gave a 9. The highest amount of points that I would give it on ease of assembly, and I'll keep the tally running up there for each category. So the F16 gets a 7, the Viper gets a 9. That brings the total so far to 16 for the F16, 18 for the Viper. So the Viper's pulling ahead. And the reason that I gave the Viper higher points than the Eachine F16 is I'm a huge fan of bolt-together airframes. Think about it for a minute. You get your new aircraft, and if it's all bolt together, then you could have that aircraft in the air the same day that you get it. If you have to glue components together, every glue that I've used says 24 hours for full cure. So by the time that you get the assembly completed, you're going to have to wait another 24 hours before you put it in the air if you want the glue to be completely cured. And I do. I never launch one. I never take one out and launch it without having the glue completely cured. Now, there's more components to glue on the Eachine F16 than there is on the Viper. Now, you have magnets on the 2 wing sections for the Eachine F16. But because I wasn't sure if I was going to have to do wingtip launches with this jet rather than belly launches, I've got several planes that I do wingtip launches with rather than belly launches. I did not want to trust those magnets to a wingtip launch, so I did glue the two main wing halves on, and then you still have to glue on the two halves of the horizontal stabilizer and the vertical stabilizer. I gave more points to the Viper because the main wing section is one piece and it bolts onto the airframe, but then you have to glue in the horizontal stabilizer. If they would have had the horizontal stabilizer as bolt-on as well as the wings, then I probably would have taken another point away from the F-16. But even though the main wing was bolt-on, since I had to glue on the horizontal stabilizer, I still had to wait 24 hours before I could take it out and launch it in the air. So 7 for the F-16, 9 for the Viper. The F-16 has 16 points, the Viper has 18 points. Ease of launch of either one of these aircraft. Both of them are extremely easy to launch. I launch both of them at full throttle, whether I've got a 3S LiPo in it or a 4S with a 3S Plus power system, which is the way I've been flying these jets recently, and I like that. I would prefer to have full 4S power on them, but I haven't had a chance to replace the 30 amp ESCs yet. So the 3S Plus power system has given me the opportunity to have a lot more power over a standard 3S system without having to push the amps over the stock 30 amp speed controllers. And I'm really happy with the performance of both of them on that. And the ease of launch, I gave the F-16 a 9 and I gave the Viper an 8. And the reason that I did that, I have not had a failed launch on the Eachine F16, and I have more flights on the F16 than I have on the Viper. And I had a failed launch on the Viper, and the reason I had a failed launch is because the foam on the Viper is very, very slick, and you have this little handhold down here. And so when I launched it with the handhold, and I had launched it several times previously without a problem, but it only takes one time, and that foam is so slick that when I launched it, my fingers slipped, and so I didn't have enough forward momentum on the Viper when I let go of it. Even though I had it at full throttle, it came down and it landed pretty flat on the skids that I'd installed on it. But the fact that I had a failed launch with it, what I ended up doing, and here's a tip for you, is I took my glue gun and I put it on a low temperature setting. It has two temperatures, high and low, and I just shot a bead of hot glue on either side of these handholds, and then just use a piece of plastic or a piece of foam to squeegee that to make a nice thin film of hot glue on the inside of these handholds, and that gives a rubberized texture. And so I have launched it many more times since I've done that, and I haven't had another failed launch with it. But the fact that I had a failed launch with it to begin with and had to do that, I took 1 point away from the Viper. So at ease of launch with the Eachine F16 getting 9 points and the Viper getting 8, our total score now for the F16 is 25, and our total score for the Viper is 26. So we're still leading by 1 point here. Okay, on to the next category. Okay, so next criteria is stability. Both of these aircraft fly like they're on a rail. I mean, they hold their line exceptionally well. You get it trimmed out. They hold their attitude extremely well at cruise speed and at full throttle. One of the things that I love to do to test out the stability of a plane is I like to go full throttle, go completely vertical, roll it over, wait until it gets to stall speed where it's barely moving, pull it over the top and see if it falls through without any problems. And both of these aircraft do that. Even the F-16 really surprised me. You don't usually think of a military jet being able to do stuff like that. But both of these jets do that. They're both extremely aerobatic. They have good slow flight capabilities, so they can lose a lot of their momentum and they won't drop a wing. The stall characteristics are exceptional on both of these aircraft. The F16 edges out the Viper ever so slightly because you can do high alpha with this one. I haven't tested high alpha on the Viper yet, but I do not think that the high alpha on the Viper is going to be as good as the F16. That was on a 3S LiPo when I tested that. It was not on a 4S LiPo with a 3S Plus power system where it has significantly more power. I tested the high alpha on this on a 3S LiPo. It does high alpha exceptionally well. And the other thing that was the deciding factor for me is when you're coming in for a landing, when the Viper gets to close to stall speed, it doesn't drop a wing, but what it starts to do is it starts to wander back and forth. And when you're landing out in the area where I have to land, where the hard pack lane is surrounded by scrub, you don't want it to slide off the lane. So when it starts wandering back and forth when you're coming in for a landing, it makes it a little hard to keep it centered in that landing area so that when it slides to a stop, it's not going to go into the scrub. The F16, when you're bringing it in for a landing and it gets close to stall speed, it maintains its line. It'll drop its nose when it gets to stall speed. You know, it'll flatten out. But it doesn't wander back and forth, it doesn't drop a wing. Also, if I come in a little bit too fast to where the skids hit that hard pack that's really, really bumpy, sometimes it will launch the plane back up in the air again. When the Viper gets launched up in the air, last time I had it out, it got launched up in the air, it actually tried to roll over on me. So that was kind of a close call. The F-16 has gotten launched back up in the air 3 or 4 times on my landings, and it still maintained its attitude and came back down. So on stability, I give the F-16 a 9, I give the Viper an 8. That gives 34 points for the F-16, 34 points for the Viper, so we're tied back up again. The next set of criteria is aerobatic capability. Now, I just talked about being able to take these vertical, roll them over, wait until they get to almost, you know, to the point where they're not moving anymore, roll them over, pull the nose down, let them drop through. Both of these jets do that. Both of these jets will stay in the air and not stall on you if you do abrupt turns with them and they lose a lot of their momentum. My other 2 EDF jets will not do that. You have to keep the speed up on them. They both have excellent slow flight capability. They do loops and rolls and split S maneuvers with no problem whatsoever. Roller coaster turns, no problem whatsoever. They maintain their line. So on stability, or excuse me, on aerobatic capability, I gave the Eachine a 9 and I gave the Viper a 9, and that brings the tally up to 43 for the Eachine F16, 43 for the Viper. We are still tied. Next set of criteria. Now that we've had it in the air, we've launched it, we found out how stable it is, we've tested the CG, we've tested the control surface movements. One important factor for me on recommending a plane, how accurate is the documentation? How accurate is the documentation for where the CG should be located, and how accurate is the documentation for the control surface movement so that it's not under controlled, it's not over controlled, and where the balance is where it should be on the plane when you get it up in the air. Because believe me, I've recently had one of my EDF jets where that information was so far off, it resulted in a crash. The documentation on both of these for where the CG should be located and these starting control surface movements, and I started both off in low rates, and I still have them in low rates, worked absolutely fine. There was no problems whatsoever. The CGs were good. The starting control surface movements were good. Then you work out, you know, to your flying style, what you want your dual rate and your expo to be, trim it out and get it flying exactly the way you want. But as a starting point, those were right on the money. So for documentation accuracy, I gave the Eachine a 9, the Viper a 9, That brings our total score to 52 and 52. We are still tied. Next set of criteria, stock power with the recommended LiPo. When I first took both these planes out, I used the recommended LiPo, which was a 3S, 1300 milliamp hour, 30C LiPo. I think mine are actually 35C LiPos. They only weigh 106 grams. I was able to get the CG on both of these with the recommended LiPo. Took them out and flew them, and the Viper seemed to have a little bit of an edge over the F16 on stock power. Now, I weighed both of these after I got the skids on them, and the skid systems weigh approximately the same for each one of these jets. The Viper without a battery in it weighs 380 grams. The F16 without a battery in it weighs 402 grams, 22 grams heavier than the Viper. The Viper has an 11 blade fan on its 50 millimeter EDF power system. The Eachine has a 12 blade fan on its 50 millimeter EDF system. The reason that the Eachine F16 is heavier than the Viper, I believe the vast majority of the weight comes from the fact that the Viper has a single servo with 2 connecting rods for the split elevator, whereas the Eachine F16 has independent servos, a servo for each one of the split elevators, and so it has 2 short control rods, but it has the weight of 2 servos and then 2 very long servo cables that go all the way from where the servos are located at the back of the fuselage all the way to the front of the fuselage to connect them to your receiver. I think that the majority of the additional 22 grams of weight comes from that fact. If the Eachine F16 were 22 grams lighter, the same weight as the Viper, then I don't think the Viper would have had an edge on the Eachine F16 for stock power. But because it is heavier and I think they produce pretty much the same amount of thrust, with this one being 22 grams heavier, I could feel it in the air on stock 3S LiPo. So for the stock power, I gave the Eachine 8 points, I gave the Viper 9 points. That brings the total tally for the F16 to 60 and the Viper to 61. So the Viper is edging ahead of the F16. The next set of criteria goes in line with stock power, which is stock efficiency. Not only did the Viper seem to have slightly more power than the F16 with the stock setup of a 3S LiPo, but it also seemed flying them very much the same. Part of the time heavy in the throttle, part of the time cruising around. The Viper always seemed to have a little more voltage remaining in the cells than the F16. I don't know if that is all attributable to the additional weight, the 22 grams of weight the F16 had, or if that's also where the 11 blade fan maybe has a little bit of an advantage over the 12 blade fan. I'm not sure. But it always seemed to have slightly more remaining voltage in the pack at the end of the flight compared to the F16. So on stock efficiency, I gave the Eachine 8 points and I gave the Viper 9 points. That brings the total points for the F16 to 68 and the Viper to 70. So the Viper at this point has pulled ahead by 2 points in this judging of category. Now, durability. That's something that is extremely important to me, especially in the area where I have to fly and land. If you guys have watched my flight videos, you know the terrain where I have to land, and these airframes really get punished on every landing, even if it's a good landing, because the terrain is hard packed, dirt, sand, and gravel. It's rutted, it's bumpy, and you can see it when I come in for a landing. Even if it's a soft touchdown, these airframes get really punished. Now, I have not had any problems with any durability issues on the F16. I have knocked off both of the tips of the rockets on both wings, getting them caught in the scrub. When it come in for a landing and it slides to a stop, if there's any wind pushing it, if it hits a rut or something, it's going into the scrub. So I have had to glue both of these back on, but other than that, I haven't had any major durability issues with the Eachine F16. With the Viper, I had that failed launch on it. And so it did come down and it did hit pretty hard, but it hit pretty flat and on the skids. But when it hit, it separated. There's actually a seam here where it's glued together at the factory, and right along that seam, that glue let go. And so it was an easy fix, but I thought it was kind of peculiar that the glue would break loose from an impact like that, because I've had much harder impacts with the F16 than I have had with the Viper. So on durability, I gave the Eachine a 9 and I gave the Viper a 7. So at the end of that category, we are at 77 and 77, tied back up again. All right, so we are tied back up, right? So build quality, ease of assembly, ease of launch, stability, aerobatic capability, accuracy of the documentation, stock power, stock efficiency, durability. All those are objective criteria, and I ended up with the same score. It didn't help me, did it? I went through all that and it didn't help me. Both of them ended up with the same score. So I added one more category that is completely subjective. That's the only thing that I had left to use. I've used all my objective category. All I had left was something subjective, and that is the look of the aircraft. And for me, I prefer the look of the military aircraft. It just looks more wicked in the air, especially with the rockets on the wings, than a sport jet. So I gave 9 points to the F-16, 8 points to the Viper, which brings the total score to 86 for the F-16, 85 for the Viper. The F-16 wins for me by 1 single point in a completely subjective category. If you just go by the objective categories, one is just as outstanding as the other. So the solution is, if you're looking to transfer or transition into EDF jets like I did this year, you don't want to waste your money on something that doesn't fly all that well. You will not be sorry if you buy either one of these jets, or if you want the best of both worlds, sport jet, military jet, buy one of each like I did. These are absolutely exceptional flying jets. Whether you have experience with EDF jets or whether you're like me, you're wanting to transition into EDF jets, or maybe you have your first EDF jet and you're looking for something better. You won't go wrong with either one of these. There are links to each one of them in the show notes, along with the LiPo that I use in these jets. Absolutely outstanding aircraft, and I couldn't believe I sat down with all this criteria and I judged each one of these aircraft as objectively as I could, as honestly as I could for each category on a point scale. And when I got down to the end of my objective categories and I tallied up the score, they were tied. So the only tiebreaker that I could come up with was a completely subjective category, which is the looks of the airframe. So there you go. I will still refer to both of these as my favorite EDF jets. So anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I will see you in the air.